I guess I'll start. How are y'all doing? I just wanted to say I think it's so inspiring and so great to see so many women in the audience. So it's amazing to see that, and thank you so much for the really warm welcome. So one of the first questions that I want to begin, which will be really about who Basquiat was as a person. I think one of the positives and the value add here is that you have two people who were alive and contemporaries of Basquiat and are historical legends in their own right. And so I think that that's really the opportunity here to hear from them directly. So on that note, Futura and Jeffrey, can you describe who Basquiat was to you and why you think that he's so relevant now to a generation who in some cases were not even alive when he was active?
Okay, thank you very much, Shadra. Well, first, it's an honor to be here, and this is an extraordinary place. It's my second visit to the Louvre Abu Dhabi, one of the most inspiring art venues in the whole world. And it's wonderful that this great painting by Basquiat is now in the collection of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and on view here at the Louvre. And that's the occasion. And so wonderful to talk about that and to talk about our friend Jean-Michel Basquiat, who departed a long time ago, but because of the power of his personality and his work and his legend is still very much with us. So I think Leonard would agree that Jean-Michel was instantly regarded as a great artist, as a genius. So it's not a story where like somebody wasn't recognized and only years later that people understand his importance. The artists, the others who were in the community in the Lower East Side of New York City right away knew that he was extraordinary and he was special. He was always treated that way. It did take a long time for the art establishment to value his work the way it is now. We can get into that. The Lower East Side art community was very much a community in those days. It seemed that everybody knew each other. And I met Leonard something around 1980, 81, and trying to think the other day how exactly we met. I couldn't be that specific, but we were very much in the same circle. Everyone met each other. It was a unique situation. You've read about the cafes in Montparnasse in Paris in the 1920s, where it seemed all the great artists in the world converged and just met each other right casually, organically. It was very similar in New York City at that time, late 70s, early 80s. And we didn't really have cafes. We didn't need cafes because people met on the street corner. They met sitting on loading docks. It was really a culture of the streets. And people were very aware of the art that emerged on the streets. And it was an exceptional period where there was a kind of equality from the art that you saw on the trains, like Futura's art, the art on the walls of buildings, like Basquiat's Samo, concrete poetry, and the art that you saw in the galleries. It was quite a remarkable period where people came together and there was a very even dialogue. And there was not such a differentiation in wealth and success. So like, I remember when I first came to New York City, someone said, "Oh, are you coming? There's a party at Robert Rauschenberg's building." And I said, well, I don't really know him. I'm sure I can come? And the person, oh, absolutely. And I remember walking into the building, and up at the head of the stairs was Rauschenberg himself, greeting us, greeted me so warmly, welcome. That's the way it was then. And there was a lot of interaction. So maybe Leonard can also add to a description of that atmosphere.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Shadria. Thanks to the Louvre Abu Dhabi for having me here to talk about Jean, who was a super cool guy. Damn, it's 40-year challenge since that 79 event. And that's when I met Jean, actually, 79, when I guess he was 19. That would have made me 29. So I was always older than Jean-Michel. I was always older than most of my contemporaries. But I was immature. I looked young. So I guess I blended in with those guys. But my fondest memory, God, I mean, where do I start? It's just, I remember seeing Cabra in the studio. I remember it being made, maybe, or it was done, but I certainly saw it. But I wanted to say that, you know, it's so sad in a way. I mean, you know, yes, Jean's been celebrated, you know, every day since he left us, but so hard for me to, you know, it's 30 years he's gone, and like we mentioned, some of you may have not been born at that time, but to see the power of his archive, his prolific ability to just do so many incredible things almost like simultaneously. So, I mean, part of me is so happy to see him celebrate. I mean, like some years after he passed away, the Whitney stepped up. You know, people were beginning to understand, like, wow, we've lost a truly important artist of our generation. We need to elevate him. And, you know, I just think it's fantastic that a place like this and the emerging Guggenheim and future art venues of our planet will embrace his work, and perhaps one day, maybe even my own. But just to say that having been there and seeing the beginning of what Jeffrey mentioned as kind of concrete poetry, when Jean-Michel was Samo, same-o, same old, same-o, you know, it's sort of like a code for nothing's really changing, everything is still the same. But while he was doing that, he was, in fact, introducing a whole new language for us, meaning, let's say, quote-unquote, street artists, or what I like to call my school of art, which was actually the subway, before the introduction of Times Square, before this sort of advent of downtown, this emerging decade, you know, because it's also like 79 into 80, and it was clear 80 and beyond was going to hold a lot of promise for a lot of young artists, not just Jean, not just myself, but yes, Keith and Dondi and Ramelzi and Kenny Scharf and just really hundreds. I mean, there was so many artists in New York at that time, and one of the things you got to understand, it's difficult, but there were no devices, okay? We didn't have such a controllable object in our hand that we kept gravitating to sort of find, I don't know, peace or some connection to something. And so it was upon us as just sort of people and individuals and human beings to kick it and talk to each other and share ideas. So there's a lot of that hanging out together, talking about something, you know, Jean being very political in a sense of his messaging, and I thought was very clever to sort of do this poetic thing and kind of right in the neighborhood of what was the center of fine art in New York. I mean, it was quote-unquote Soho, and we had 57th Street, and then we had the East Village, which was this alternative. I mean, the whole idea of an alternative space, I feel, kind of begins then in places like Fashion Moda and other obscure pop-up spaces. Okay, I could go on. No, carry on, sorry.
So actually, kind of going off of the PowerPoint, Cabra, leads me to the next question. And I want to ask you both, what sort of, is there an image of it? Okay, there's Cabra in the studio in Anina Nosei's basement. Why do you think that Basquiat references, boxing so much in his artwork, particularly images like with Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali? And can you, in particular, describe what it was like when you saw it in? You said you saw him making it, or was it already finished?
Well, I've been in that space when he was working. I used to go down there and say hi to him. When Jean was in this studio at Anina's space, once again, it was like you could just sort of roll right up on him. If he was in there, you could peek down and see that someone was in there working. Hey, Jean, am I disturbing you? No, come down. Let's hang out. So the quote unquote, let's just use the famous Negro athletes as an example. And I think why Jean did that was because, look at my country, look at America, my country. We're sort of, black people even 40 years ago, who was famous really in our culture? Musicians, athletes, certainly not artists to any big degree at that time. And, that's why totally props to Jean for kind of not just being, in my opinion, one of the top 10 ever, GOAT status, greatest of all time, but also representing a diversity of culture. It's not just a white person's domain. And I think the athletes were just people he could, he respected, whether it was Sugar Ray, Muhammad, Joe Louis, Satchel Paige, Jackie Robinson. Any black man in America emerging in the 40s, 50s, 60s. It was kind of groundbreaking. And I feel they were, in fact, the most popular black, celebrities, or what you want to call them, of the generation. And I think Jean identified very much with that, in addition to all of his library, touching back African art and that whole historical context. Jeffrey?
Yes. Well, I think that Jean-Michel identified with these great black athletes, particularly the boxers. And in preparation for this, I was remembering back and remember when I visited Jean-Michel in his studio, and he was a very sweet guy, but he could also be aggressive and confrontational. And he sort of treated my visit to him that day as a boxing match. And I remember him saying, okay, let's lock horns. He loved that combat. And he saw himself as in the ring of himself. He was up against the art establishment, up against American society, but he was also sort of in a contest with his friends, with his fellow artists, who was going to be the champ. And so I see this as very personal. And so with the image of the bull head or the goat head, there are references to Muhammad Ali and Muhammad Ali's opponent in a famous fight. But I also see that as a kind of self-portrait that he identifies with Muhammad Ali and with these fighters. There's, I think you got the impression, there's an amazing series of portraits of the great black boxers. And Cabra is one of the most interesting, one of the most developed of this, because it actually has the boxing ring. But I see it as Jean-Michel himself in the ring, proving himself.
It's interesting that in terms of my research, I'm not engaging Cabra so much, but some of the themes that come up in the painting, the the boxing, but also trying to interrogate more what that means in a highly specific context of a Black man engaging with these myths in a sense, but also these figures. And I think that, it's difficult to talk about Basquiat invoking sort of the great Black boxers of the past, which in that time was the recent past, without talking about the way that Black men in general, Black celebrities have engaged boxing as both a competitive mechanism, but also a coping mechanism. One of Basquiat's heroes, Miles Davis, was a very avid boxer, and Basquiat would have certainly have known that. And a little bit before 1981, or around the time, Marvin Gaye, who not really sure so much their engagement, but Marvin Gaye was also a very avid boxer. And so I think, the research isn't quite there yet, but what does it mean for Black men who find themselves in very isolated social and professional circles to engage the iconography of boxing? And what does it mean it's not just a historical representation, it's what Futuro was saying and what Jeffrey was saying. He's competing, he's in the boxing ring, but he's also in the boxing ring of history. And what is going on and happening in which Black men in particular create this arena in their work or in their personal lives of boxing. And so I think that it's super important to think about that in the sense of their work, their identity, where masculinity is, where the boundaries of healthy or not so healthy are. And I think that it's really exciting to see where the research can and will go with a more rigorous interpretation and inquiry into those questions. Do you want to add something?
I think there's also, this is so interesting, there's an analogy between the boxing ring and the canvas. And so, not just in Cabra, in this painting, but in many works there are Basquiat, there are images of punching, of the kind of like the cartoon rays of like when you punch and there are these arrows coming out. So I think that he sees a very interesting analogy between the boxing ring and the canvas, and what an artist does and what a boxer does, and is very conscious of the physicality of painting. It's fascinating how Basquiat's work synthesizes his interest in poetry, writing, music, sports, his feeling of New York City. It's all in there. And I think it's also important not to interpret a painting like Cabra too literally. Right. Like just say, oh, this is about this particular bout of Muhammad Ali. Right. No, I think that he was somebody who took all these impulses, all the things that stimulated him, and made them all personal. And so there are numerous things going on in a painting like that that's not just a literal rendering of a boxing match. It's very much about him and his identity and his sense of who he is in the world. We saw an amazing image there of a great painting, Joe Louis surrounded by snakes. And I always took that as a reading of of course, it's not just Joe Louis, it's Jean-Michel himself, surrounded by kind of the manipulating art dealers, art collectors who are trying to take advantage of him. And he was very aware of that, very conscious of that. So if you study all these boxing paintings, you learn a lot about Jean-Michel and who he was and his situation and his attitudes.
Which is a great segue into the next question, or next questions. If you both can describe in your own particular way the chapters of his professional life and how that influenced his artwork and his relationship and proximity to fame, like how did that show up in his artwork or not show up? And do you think the politics or the fame influenced the politics of his work, or did the politics influence his fame?
I mean, I just wanted also not to avoid that question. I think it's hard, though, to know what the politics were, because I feel like, as Jeffrey said, it's not just the boxing thing. It's so many subtleties in what he was doing, and you couldn't keep up with Jean's brain because he was really calculating things like a lot at his processor was like crazy. But just cut forward past this era, and when him and Andy did their show, look at the poster of that. It's them with boxing gloves. So that kind of brings home what Jeff was saying about him in the ring against his opponents, whoever they may be. And of course, Andy was a collaborator and a friend, but at the same time, he wanted to knock Andy out. I mean, he even stated as much, privately, as saying like, well, it's no contest. I mean, the subtle memories I have of just conversational JMB, Jean-Michel Basquiat, were always crazy because he was, like I say, he was always thinking about stuff and pitting himself against what was really, I mean, if you think about it, like, what are the odds of someone like Jean-Michel arriving? Really stacked against him. And I feel like what helped him a lot was his brilliance, really. I mean, not just creativity or the fact that he could just keep it going nonstop, but just that he thought a lot about things like that. And I think the politics, it's not like, it's different. I wouldn't ever call him a political artist, okay, in that sense. And how we would think of political artists as like, oh yes, you're visually creating something that's associating, some event or some crisis or some problem you have with someone's government. This was more of a social politics, I think, for Jean. And also what Jeffrey was saying about the quote-unquote snakes of the art world who still exist today. There probably could be some in the room. I don't know. But I mean, let's not be naive and think that, oh yeah, everyone's just there to support you. No, they're not. They're there to take advantage of you. They're there to exploit you. They're there to ultimately bring you down. So I think the battle of just being a successful artist in New York City in 1979, 80, 81, 82, like 40 years ago, very difficult. Probably even more difficult today, but equally as difficult back then. And I think he was a kind of one-man show. He didn't need support. He didn't need a backup, dancer or somebody, on a cello. He could just wing it. And although he was like, for the most part, soft-spoken and kind of like quiet and, almost like a deliberate delivery, he was completely aware, I think, of everybody around him and who posed a threat and who was potentially an ally. And I think he worked it very well. I mean, he became the radiant child, right? I mean, that's the whole secret of his success, is that he really was that. It's not like somebody made it up and gave him a label. I think he far exceeded being labeled anyway. It's like, how do you describe Jean-Michel? I always thought he was a little bit of like a savant. You're not like an idiot savant, but you got like savant qualities. You're just super wise, but like not educated in university, like a kind of Goodwill Hunting wise, that you could just pick up a book and just have a kind of understanding of something, or just assimilate all that history and be able to process it. Whereas someone like me, bit ignorant to that whole structure of what the art world is, the historical, hey, you have to, he was telling me you have to pay tribute to it. You have to show the art world that you know its history. And when people were comparing me to Kandinsky, he said it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Because it's they're associating you with something, whereas for me, as a street kid in New York, if you accuse me of being influenced by someone or it looks like someone, I would take offense to it because copying, stealing, biting, whatever we call it, was like very taboo for the culture. So to be thought as someone who's been influenced by something that I didn't even know about, well, Jean later said, hey man, don't worry about that, run with it. Yeah, you're in this abstract field, embrace it. Whereas I didn't know anything about those sort of things, and so Jean taught me a lot.
I think we just, as an aside, should talk about Leonard, about Futura. So Futura was really the great innovator who introduced abstraction into street art. That's really, he's in a class by himself. So during a period when almost everyone else was painting bubble letters or art based on cartoon figures, Futura came out with something completely different. You never saw anything like it. And that's why people like myself said, well, he's like Kandinsky, even though he didn't copy from Kandinsky. Kandinsky is one of the artists who invented abstraction the turn of the last century. And Futura is the person who invented abstraction for street art. And it's a very distinctive style that the idea is so big, you're still running with it. It's still generating lots of ideas. So just want to have this aside so people understand who Futura is and his influence. And just like I said with Jean-Michel, that people on the scene instantly understood, this guy is really significant. The same understanding with Futura, instantly out of the, how many, maybe several hundred street artists who were on the scene, he was instantly in the top 5 of the ones who were respected.
Not bad. Not bad. To sort of respond to things that both Jeffrey and Futura have mentioned, when Futura mentioned that he wouldn't call Basquiat necessarily a political artist, I agree with that. I think that it takes some work to figure out where he is on that spectrum and on that landscape of politics, social, history. And I think that, there's always, I think right now, the art history, we're trying to figure out the language for that, right? Like, what do you say about an artist that is engaging with seismic historical topics and figures and legacies, but there's also the conundrum and contradiction that during his lifetime, Basquiat almost never depicted current events in his work. And so if we're talking about political art and political artists, how do we contend with the fact that the issues or conversations around apartheid are absent from his work, which were, that was a big issue in the 80s. How do we grapple with the fact that he was also not talking about the AIDS crisis in his work? And there's also that, and of course it gets into other conversations and questions that we don't have time for, but when we're looking at artists of color, are we really engaging with what we want to see from them or the actual work? And then you, on the flip side, have artists like Keith Haring, who his work is full of current events and engagement with these issues, both timeless historical issues, but also the events of his era and of his generation. And so I think that I think it's a good thing, and I think it's a good problem to have, to really be super singular and specific when you're talking about Basquiat, and not just kind of siloing him as a political artist, because I'm not sure how much that holds up when we're actually engaging with the work. And so, which kind of leads to my next question, which might be the last question before we open it up for Q&A. You'll like this one. Discuss how the value of his artwork developed and changed over time.
Okay, well, I'd like to go back to the political question too, but to answer your question, okay, so almost from the beginning, Basquiat's work had a market, and took a while for it to get to $110 million. But I think I was the first person to buy his work. I bought 5 drawings off the floor of his girlfriend's apartment for $50 each, I think in the fall of 1980. The market support came very quickly. Our friend Diego Cortez curated a remarkable exhibition called New York New Wave at PS1 that's now part of the Museum of Modern Art. It was in the spring of 1981, and it was a fantastic wall of Basquiat's work. And there was one remarkable canvas, and Diego told me that was bought by Christophe de Menil, from the famous family of art patrons from Houston. So like that's amazing. Like the first time out with a canvas, a member of the most prestigious collecting family in America, or maybe in the world for contemporary art, buys the painting. So that's what was happening. And the beginning prices, maybe that was $1,000. The paintings in the first show at Anina Nozay Gallery and then the Fun Gallery, they were $10,000. Not particularly expensive for that time, but particularly now. But they were bought by great collectors. Peter Brandt bought the biggest painting in Anina's show. He still has it. And others were bought by very leading art patrons. The Newman family, great collectors of Picasso and Miro and others. So he was immediately recognized. And I actually set the record price right after he died. I paid $99,000 for this great self-portrait with Andy Warhol called Two Heads. And that's one of the great images of the artist. So that was in the Andy Warhol auction. There was a kind of a dip in the values in the early 90s, like there was for a lot of artists. But it picked up again. But I don't think anyone would have foreseen these astonishing prices, 40, 50, $100 million. That's unique. Only a few artists in history get prices like that. And so it's very significant. It's not just about the art market, it's about cultural history. So for Jean-Michel Basquiat to be ranked the price level that only Picasso, Francis Bacon, Leonardo da Vinci receive, that's pretty amazing. To be maybe in the top 5 of the world of any artist, living past our century, past centuries, that's an absolutely astonishing thing. And there are many reasons for this. Number one, of course, is the quality of the work. That as time goes on, it remains as powerful as ever, even more powerful. And as we are able to analyze it more, so important in synthesizing the culture of our time. But also there's the myth. Jean-Michel is like the Vincent van Gogh of his time, with this tragic myth that somehow even people who are very successful, somehow they see some of that in themselves. They see the scorned artist.
Yeah, I mean, there was some self-destruction going on, I feel. Yeah, but that's interesting, the Van Gogh of our story there. But yeah, I mean, the value, wow, I can't even approach that. And I didn't even know all that, Jeffrey, about, who bought what when. But when I came back from an experience in 1981, I was on tour with a group in the UK called The Clash, and for the era, that was like a really big deal, and I left just some kid from the street, and when I came back, it was like, oh my God, you're the guy with The Clash, and I had some money and cut to Jean-Michel on St. Mark's Place, a street in New York City in the Lower East Side, selling his postcards or his hand-done art on paper. And I was like, oh, John, let me get a couple of those, and I gave him a $100 bill for 2 of them. He was going to give them to me. I said, nah, man, come on, let me support you. And, here I am, some dumb guy thinking like I'm helping a young emerging artist. And cut to 5 years later after that Warhol opening. And we're at his home, and everyone's celebrating him and drinking some bottle of wine that someone said was like $1,000. And totally happiness and, 80s New York, just overdosing on a lot of levels. And Jean handed me an envelope with $500 in it. And I was like, what's going on? He's like, yeah, man, I didn't forget that time you tried to help me. And I was like, oh, man, please, I can't take this. And he basically wouldn't not let me accept it. And, yeah, I mean, I took it. But just to show that, he didn't forget that one little act of kindness, which to me wasn't really, it was just me being me, but super sweet of him to come back and, pay back that debt, even though that was obviously not required. And it wasn't required. I'm just trying to buy and support, from my friend. But just to say that he was a very great friend and someone who I wished I would have spent, it's like obviously when people are gone, you're like, oh, damn, I should have said this to them, or I wished I would have had more time with them. And me too, I wished I would have just had more time with him, I think that's the first feeling when a friend is gone. And not a family member, but, a friend that, did we say the right stuff on the last meeting? I wished I would have had more time with him. But when I'm here today and we're all about him and his legacy, I'm just so proud to have had the experience I had with him, no matter how sporadic it was when I saw him. And once he started to really take off, I was just not in his space as much as I was in the beginning, but always so proud. I mean, as New Yorkers, we're very proud of our own, and he's the best we ever had. So super proud.
I think just to kind of follow what they've said, I forgot which poet said it, but but basically the quote, he belongs to the ages, and I think that that's very fitting and appropriate about Basquiat at this point. And I think when I think about what that means in terms of his artwork, I also think about the fact that his artwork is, the price point is out of the reach of most museums. And what does this mean for an artist that truly belongs to the ages when the artwork is not accessible for most institutions and thus the public. And so we were last night having a wonderful conversation. I was having a conversation with one of the organizers of this program and the series of programs, Rose Demir, and we were talking about what are the challenges and what does it mean for his work to hopefully move into the museums or move into public collection, which I hope is something that in my lifetime happens, that we start to see that shift so that more people can engage with the work, for better or for worse. And I also believe, and I'm not a dealer, so I can say this, but you never own the work. You own it legally, but I think collectors, curators, you're always a steward of the work. And what does that mean to steward something? Because you can't take it with you. And it always belongs to the artist. It belongs to the person who made it. And so kind of just thinking about those moral or philosophical or even spiritual questions when we think about the value of his work and the astronomical price point, pricing and value, it's going to be an interesting negotiation, but I think it's a negotiation and a fight that is worth having. So that concludes the talk, but we'd like to open it up for Q&As, or for Q&A rather.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask about I know that this might sound superficial, I guess, but sort of like the relationship between Basquiat and Warhol a little bit. Because to me, it seems like they're working on completely different spectrums. Like one is all about American consumerism, and then the other one just seems like not for that, I guess. But to my understanding, I think Basquiat was really upset over the death of Warhol. So I just would like to know, like, what sort of relationship did they have? Were they like frenemies, or was it like a mentor-mentee relationship? And did it affect like the other's work or something like that?
Well, following up on Leonard's story about buying something from Basquiat on the street and Basquiat being very grateful and generous, I'll relay a story about Andy Warhol and Basquiat. So Jean-Michel had this compass to know exactly where to position himself. And this is pretty remarkable. He was still a teenager. He saw that Andy Warhol and the curator Henry Geldzahler went into this restaurant in Soho to have lunch. And so amazing that even as a teenager, he knew who they were. And he followed them in with his little Xerox collages and went up to their table and asked if Andy and Henry would buy one. And it's a pretty outrageous thing to do, is sort of like invade someone's space in a restaurant. And you don't really do that in New York, because you sort of people respect people's anonymity. But Andy, instead of yelling, get out of here, kid, he was very generous and he bought one. And Jean-Michel never forgot that. So years later, this is 1982, the dealer Bruno Bischofberger from Zurich had been introduced to Jean-Michel's work through Nina Nozay, and he really understood it. He was also Warhol's dealer for many years, and he just got it right away that Jean-Michel was the real thing. And he began getting involved in his work, and he thought, wouldn't it be a great idea to introduce Jean-Michel and Andy over lunch? And he wasn't aware that there was already this encounter. So Jean-Michel comes to lunch at Warhol's factory in Union Square, and after the lunch, Jean-Michel rushes back to his studio, and this is an extraordinary thing, shows his genius. In probably an hour or so, he paints that masterpiece that I mentioned that I had bought from the Warhol estate. It's just such a powerful image. You should look it up. And he brings it over to Warhol's studio, still wet in a taxi, and gives it to Andy as a gift. And talking to Jean-Michel later about it, it was partly his excitement about connecting with Warhol, but also it was that he was so grateful that Andy had made that gesture of buying from him years ago when he was just a teenage kid. And that shows his humanity and incredible generosity. So the relationship with Warhol is very genuine, and it was certainly helped along by this dealer, Bruno Bischofberger, who set up a project of collaboration paintings, partly a business gimmick, but partly something we understood to put together the greatest artist of one generation and the greatest artist of the next generation. And those collaboration paintings, such an important project. Some of them aren't that great. Some of them are astonishing. Some of them are much more Warhol, some of them more Basquiat. We haven't really fully had the right show of them to understand them. But an amazing thing. And they went both ways. Jean-Michel pushed Andy to go back to hand painting, and Andy's use of silkscreen helped inspire Jean-Michel with his use of Xerox. So it's a very interesting relationship. The story is go on about the whole relationship and what happened. But we'll take another question and want to hear about that and tell you more.
Any other questions?
Hi. So I just have a question about the money for his paintings. Where does it go after his death?
Oh, where's the money go? Well, so Jean-Michel's family still has some great works. So some of the money does go to the family, and he has 2 sisters, and they have their children. So he provided very well for his family, but a lot of the big money, it unfortunately goes to speculators who play the game of buying the work at auction.
Questions?
So hi. If let's say for some reason Basquiat wasn't the artist he was, what would he be or do based on his personality or passion, like his interests other than art? Music.
He was a music producer. He produced a great record with Ramel Z. So if he was still alive, I'd see that he would be producing very important music. And also, you see, he was an actor. He was in Downtown 81. He was someone who could do almost anything. I could see him also as a celebrated actor.
In the talk later on tonight, there will be a 20-minute clip of Tamara Davis's Radiant Child, and I think in the clip, in the edit, she asks him that same question, and he said that he'd be a film director, and he'd be a filmmaker. And we were talking about this last night, just engaging with his work and the pop cultural references and the cinematic quality and the film references and influences. I could totally see that, and I don't know that that the title is public, but he also wrote a screenplay that the family still has. So I think he probably would have also moved into film at some point, like a lot of painters of the 80s did in the 90s, like Robert Longo and Julian Schnabel. So.
Okay, I can ask I kind of have two questions, so I'm just gonna ask them and then you can answer whichever one. It was said in the talk that it was hard, I mean, it was hard to be an artist in New York then and even harder now. I mean, why do you think that is? Is it like, I mean, what contributes to that? Is it because there's like more competition in the same place, or is it about institutions and what they shed light on? That's one. And the other one is talking about that period of time. Art was still daring and challenging, and it feels like we're moving towards safer art. I mean, do you think that's true or not? And if yes, then why is that? Like, what do you think changed to lead us to more like safer art?
Well, yeah. Well, society has changed. The world has changed. You know, we were in a much more, I don't want to say violent time, but there was a lot of rebellion and aggression. That's what this whole movement was spawned from. You know, the coming out of the 60s, you know, the 70s was a kind of incubation period for my subway school to, you know, be born. And by the time, like I say, I met Jean in 79, by the beginning of the 80s, yeah, I mean, there was still a lot of rebellion. I mean, Samo's concrete poetry, Jean-Michel writing in the street, it's an illegal act. It's vandalism. I mean, you're breaking the law. By doing that, you're defacing public property and private property. I think today, things have just been dumbed down and homogeneous. You know, it's just like very bland, and there's not this necessity to rebel against a kind of society, you know, 5-10 years ago, because we're in a kind of dormant stage now where everyone's just sort of, there's a lot of consuming going on, and, you know, people aren't really frustrated, I guess. But I agree with you that the whole thing is less aggressive and much more edible and digestible now. It doesn't mean it's not as good. It just means that the times have changed, and the place for that radical artist certainly still exists. I mean, the streets, you know, the streets are the streets. There'll always be that, no matter what city you're in. But I think the mood is more about, hey, let's all be included. Let's all be on the same page. You know, let's not rock the boat. And I guess when things are going well, you don't necessarily want to do that. So, yeah, I mean, it's a 40-year, 30 years, you know, God, things have just changed. And was Jean angry coming up? Probably, yeah. Was I? Definitely. And I was kind of trying to take that anger out in a way I couldn't understand. I just started calling it creative expression, but it's a lot of frustration. You know, these days there's a lot to be upset about, certainly. I mean, I don't know about here, but in my country, there's a lot to be angry about. But, you know, you look at the face of street art as we know it today, not the institutional level. I don't think the institutions, we were talking about the competition and why was it such. It's just because, yeah, it's New York. You know, it's super competitive, and, you know, there's always someone who could just come right in with no backstory and just, you know, kind of like jump over you. These days, I don't know. I think people are more conscious about higher institutions of art, the best gallery in town, being acquired by a museum. But one last thing I want to say is the fact that Jean-Michel was so celebrated, as was Andy and Keith and a lot of us in the 80s then, but that he was as celebrated in life. You know, I mean, it didn't used to happen that way. I think traditionally artists had to either be dead and then their families or the legacy could you know, shine. But an artist being successful in his or her own life was kind of didn't really happen yet. So, you know, I mean, Andy's an exception, because I feel when we met Andy, and I remember being at the factory and being in awe of just like, oh my God, I'm in this studio space, and you know, oh, there's so and so, but just to say that I feel back then we weren't thinking about higher levels of art. You know, we were just thinking about having a show in a gallery, like just getting an exhibition in the XYZ gallery would have been dope. You know, because for Menina Jose, yeah, before Jean really took off, he was in a place called Fun Gallery, which was like run by a kooky lady named Patty, who was super sweet and just kind of wanted everyone to just hang out and do what they did, you know, so there was no pressure from a kind of institution, but I think that's changed now. I think everyone's very conscious of that, and artists today, not myself, but most artists today are really like trying to maneuver and do whatever they can do to find those, you know, landing spots.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I wanted to ask, given Basquiat's origins as a street artist and then, you know, his subsequent success, both commercially and then being recognized by the institution, how do you think that has changed the way that the institution views street art, or even, I guess, legitimized the canon of street art and street artists working today?
Just so that I can repeat, your question is how that I understand, your question is how have institutions responded to him as a street artist, and has that affected the way that they collect him?
More like, how has Basquiat's success influenced the perception of street artists?
Okay. Well, I'll kind of add my thing, and I think Jeffrey would be a great person to ask because he's done probably the most comprehensive museum show about graffiti. I think that it's TBD. You know, we're still figuring out how this will all shake out. You know, I think that there will be a response, and that more museums will engage with graffiti. They will engage with street artists. What it will look like, I don't know. I do know that the scholarship on Basquiat is woefully incomplete, and when we're talking about other graffiti artists, it's almost non-existent, and there just aren't enough people studying it and adding that sediment of work. So it will take some time, but hopefully we'll see that change, both like in scholarship and what museums collect.
Well, first, I want to go back to Afra's question about what happened between art in the early 1980s and art now. It's essential question. And art is actually a very different situation then and now. So there was hardly even an art market for contemporary art. It was more a community. Now it's beyond a market, it's an industry. And art became so professionalized, and museums are more and more of a business, and they're in the tourism business, you know, they're in the event business. And because it became so professionalized, it sort of became a little bit corporate. And just like, let's say, a big corporation, they have to be very careful. They have to be very moderate. They can't be so radical because they might offend customers. So somehow that's where galleries, museums, and even artists are. And so you don't see very many artists going out and being truly radical. Artists don't, there are plenty of exceptions, but they generally don't want to rock the boat. And I think the difference between this period we're talking about with Jean-Michel and Leonard coming out, you could do whatever you wanted, because it wasn't, oh, if you do this, you're going to hurt your market, or you're going to hurt your reputation, because you were in something smaller. So in a way, our contemporary art's become so successful to get this gigantic audience, 100,000 people going to art fairs and big attendance at museum shows and these prices, but somehow it's made everything safer as people have to feel they have to adhere to the what's accepted in this system. But it's a big topic, and we can talk about it more.
Last question.
Hi again. I want to know, like, for you guys, from spending time with him, with John, did he ever have dreams for his future? Like, if he was still alive today, what would he be doing?
I didn't understand exactly his. Oh. Oh. Wow. Yeah. No, I mean, to me, his future was, as I recall, no, I don't recall. Before we were talking about what would he have done had he not been a famous artist, and I said music and film and other things. But I think it's clear, like, he wanted very much to be, the most important artist of his time. And, as it was sort of translated by other things we said today. And, I mean, that ultimately is the legacy, beyond him just being a painter in the moment or artist in the moment. I think what I recall about him talking about the future was how one day he would be this great artist, so very prophetic.
I think that there's a reason why he used the crown as his abstract symbol. He saw himself as the king.
I just wanted to ask like one last question since I have you guys here. Well, I wanted to ask about how Basquiat's identity has almost been romanticized by consumer society, and it's almost like how you see Frida Kahlo's face plastered on every merchandise that you can think of. So I just wanted to ask your opinion on that, and maybe if you would know how he would have thought of that happening as well, since he's not alive to kind of defend himself over these things.
Well, I didn't know Basquiat, and I, was barely alive when he was active, so I have kind of a distance and a detachment from it in a lot of ways. Retail and that sort of thing is just so, it's not like my wheelhouse. It's not what I think about a lot of the time. It's both jarring and understandable. Most people are not going to be able to afford a Basquiat drawing or a painting, and I think that people just want to be close to him. It's a way, both consuming, but it's also a way of having a piece of him, and I understand that gesture and that impulse, and so I think it's not a problem. I think more so the concern for me is always that the scholarship is not in a place where I'd like to see it. So I think that, because you also look at Picasso, which is, retailed to the 9th degree, and it's okay, or the nth degree. So I don't think that means that the scholarship is bad or poor. It's just, I think they can coexist. It's just not equal, I think, with Basquiat right now.
Well, I think his father was an accountant, and his father just liked the idea of making money with these reproductions. Some of them are really bad, like Basquiat sneakers. I think they're just terrible. But with Basquiat, the work is so great that it is bigger than all the bad merchandise. So would Jean-Michel have done that himself? Probably not at all. But because he had much higher goals.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our lovely speakers.